all of Alexander Pope's work, probably the most popular today, the most read of all of his work, and he wrote a lot, is The Rape of the Lock. It is it's his masterpiece, quite frankly. It is a mock heroic epic in his paradigmatic heroic couplets, where he uses a very epic, grand tone for a very trivial incident. In that incident, based on true life, a man cuts a lock of hair from a woman, and universal outrage follows. This savages the high society culture that largely barred him at the beginning of his life, but he started to get some inroads in as he grew more popular. So he was always a little bit of that outsider looking in, and when he found himself in, he was able to maintain that perspective. The poem was published in essentially two different versions. The first came out in 1712, and it was expanded 2 years later. And in the year in between, he announced his plan to translate the Iliad, and he published it in between the two versions. So those two works, the Iliad and the Rape of the Lock, are very much intertwined. They were on his mind. Certainly, when he announced his plans to translate the Iliad, that means he had probably already been working on it for some time, so it was in his blood, so to speak. And as he is writing this on a very different note, there's a lot of cross currents between those two zones of creativity, we might call them. The actual incident that prompted this, of course, it happened in 1711, and it happened essentially that one guy, a nobleman, clipped a piece of hair off a young lady, and the outrage of this in high society was considerable. And it sounds a little silly and trivial to us today. You can go off on, well, okay, this is a bodily violation, and it is, and it certainly would not be tolerated today. But still, let's keep some perspective here. When you put it in contrast with the bodily violation of, let's say, Paris's kidnapping of Helen, it's not really an easy comparison there. So that's probably the frame to think of this in. You don't want to get too modernist in the perspective. The incident prompted the two, bystanders, let's say, fellow members of that circle, to try and reconcile the two families of the principal actors in this, the man and the woman, who needed some reason to come back together and make nice so everybody could go on with their nice little garden party lives. And so they approached Pope and said, would you mind writing a little something to, let's help smooth over the waters. Let's just, make sure we're all feeling good about this. And he did. And this is that. And he addresses this in a little preamble to the poem. And you can get into that if you want. But it's aside from the broad context, it's not necessarily helpful to your enjoyment or understanding of the poem terribly much. The poem itself, Pope calls heroic comical on the title page. And that I find very interesting because of the balance of those terms, the heroic and the comic. There is no necessarily hierarchical relationship between those two terms, and so the balance becomes a little playful for him. It also, however, in addition to that two-handed purpose of mocking the triviality of the incident with the grandiosity of the frame, it does imply a bit of a balance and a contrast between those two terms. There, you can look at that hyphen between them as either an equal sign or a slash between, and that is significant between them. That distinction of scale that it implies, of the grandeur and the trivial, is a theme running throughout, of course, but framing it in this fashion, in that tight little term, heroic comical, intensifies it. And so as you're reading the poem, the natural grandeur, the highs seem higher, and the comical lows seem a little lower when opposed to the high. This is this is a common reference point of the Enlightenment. It demands that the perspective of the reader, of the viewer, of the narrator, be a kind of stable center, a fulcrum between these two these two extremes that demands a certain rational perspective on everybody's part to observe the silliness going on around it. This is a natural frame for this period and this particular mode of literature. You can see it in Pope's great friend Jonathan Swift, who writes Gulliver's Travels about a dozen years or so after this, honestly. In the first two books of Gulliver's Travels, at first, Gulliver is this guy who shows up in this island populated by tiny people, about 6 inches tall, and so Gulliver is a giant to them. And on the next book, in part 2 of that, he shows up on an island where it is populated by giants, and he appears minuscule, about 6 inches tall. And that shifting of perspective reminds us that we also, as readers or as thinkers, as human beings alive in the world, need to constantly shift our perspectives. And that's what I think is going on in this poem as well, where we are being toggled back and forth between the heroic and the comical, trying to encourage us to take a different view of things. And that is the Enlightenment broadly. That is the universality that the Enlightenment strives for, where we can see the natural limitations of any one perspective. Any one point of view is inherently flawed, and so we need to take an objective view of all of those views to get a fuller picture. But of course, the flaw in that reasoning that will be pointed out later on is that even that perspective of your trying for objectivity is naturally limited and flawed. And so you cannot get a truly objective perspective, no matter how rational, how elevated, how enlightened you might think you are. We are all looking at life, reality, through the scrim of our own biases. This is the underlying theme of this poem, I think. But the poem itself is just fun. The way it works with all of these ideas and the endless inventiveness of it within that heroic couplet format is just a great read. The opening lines ape Homer, which, of course, the great Homeric opening to the Iliad is so endured in us as the sound of heroic, elevated themes, that when it comes up in this, it sort of puffs us up and gets us ready for something a little bit more on that level. And Pope is working with that because every line pulses with this kind of antithesis, this kind of this and that, trivial and grand, mighty and silly, dire and amorous comes up. And all of these things just clash and remind us to always shift our perspective. What dire offense from amorous causes springs? What mighty contests rise from trivial things? I sing this verse to Carol, muse is due. This even Belinda may vouchsafe to view. Slight is the subject, but not so the praise. If she inspire, and approve my lays. Again, you can feel that two-handed thing going on here. If this, then that. But this, then that. It is the Mende of Greek composition, quite frankly. And the second stanza of the poem hints a little bit at the poem's attitude towards women and love, very specifically, before the antagonist or the incident of the poem is introduced. Say what strange motive, goddess, could compel a well-bred lord to assault a gentle belle? Oh, say what stranger cause, yet unexplored, could make a gentle belle reject a lord? In tasks so bold can little men engage, and in soft bosoms dwells such mighty rage. Again, that back and forth between the trivial and the grand, but also it's shifting it into a domestic romantic sphere here, where the battle is between man and woman, something a little bit more closeted, let's say, something a little bit more domestic, that taking the essential conflict of the epic mode off the battlefield and put it in the bedroom or the salon, where all these aristocrats are used to just hanging out and sipping wine and having little card parties and stuff like that. But those little dalliances with one another of social battle and conflict in a kind of Real Housewives sense is being equivocated or being equivalent to the grandeur of battle. So you can see how the camera is just moving from that war sensibility to a different one. And you can frame that also as a male sensibility, where men write about war, to a female sensibility, to the field of battle that women generally command. And further down, we get another travesty of Homer. After all that invocation of the goddess stuff, we get the arming of the soldier for battle, a classic bit of epic poetry throughout Homer and the epic mode generally throughout the ancient era. But also in this, you can hear little bits of the Catholic Mass, the Catholic liturgy happening on another different front, on, again, something very domestic, where a young girl gets up in the morning and applies her makeup and gets dressed and set for the day before wandering out into the field of battle, where her face will be her shield. Think of this as what is it? I think it's book 8 of the Aeneid, or is it 16? 16, I think, where it's about the Achilles' shield. Here, the shield is the well-made-up face of the young lady. And also in this, you can see a little bit of a critique of the burgeoning consumerism. In the early 1700s, the Industrial Revolution is starting to kick in. The commercial capitalist economy is starting to kick in, and people are buying more and more stuff. And so, as a savvy observer of society, Pope is taking note of this and taking a few shots here and there. And now unveiled, the toilet stands displayed, each silver vase in mystic order laid. First robed in white, the nymph in tone adores, with head uncovered, the cosmic powers. Oh, heavenly image in the glass appears, to that she bends, to that her eyes she rears. The inferior priestess at her altar's side, trembling begins the sacred rites of pride. Unnumbered treasures ope at once, and here the various offerings of the world appear. From each she nicely culls with curious toil, and decks the goddess with the glittering spoil. This casket India's glowing gems unlocks, and all Arabia breathes from yonder box. The tortoise here and elephant unite, transformed to combs, the speckled and the white. Here files of pins extend their shining rows, puffs, powders, patches, Bibles, billy-do. Now awful beauty puts on its arms, the fair each moment rises in her charms. repairs her smiles, awakens every grace, and calls forth all the wonders of her face, sees by degrees a purer blush arise, and keener lightings quicken in her eyes. The busy sylphs surround their darling care, these set the head, and those divine the hair. Some fold the sleeve, whilst others plait the gown, and Betty's praised for labor, not her own. You can see in the end there the appearance of these sylphs, these mythical creatures, these semi-divine creatures who come to aid her in getting dressed, much like in the Iliad. You have divine characters dropping in to aid various heroes and whisk them out of danger and help them get ready for battle and all of this stuff. So there's a little of that going on, but the applying of the makeup and all the very specific items within that, which the elephant and the elephant for its ivory and all of the little jeweled things and all the little boxes with all the stuff he is mocking this to a degree, but still you have to say, well, yes, it's mockery, but at the same time, there is a kind of loving respect being paid there. So you can't really come down, of course, on one side of that judgment. Belinda's character. This is the character of Belinda, the young girl getting ready, the heroine of the poem. Belinda's character is being stamped in this also as being a little vain, being a little superficial, perhaps, and but also the innocent beauty. This is her only real job in life, is to be pretty, and she does take it very seriously, and that aspect of her character is what's getting stamped in all of this. Fair nymphs and well-dressed youths around her shone, but every eye was affixed on her alone. On her white breast a sparkling cross she wore, which Jews might kiss and infidels adore. Her lively looks a sprightly mind disclose, quick as her eyes and as unfixed as those. Favors to none, to all she smiles extends. Oft she rejects, but never once offends. Bright as the sun, her eyes the gazers strike, and like the sun they shine on all alike. Yet graceful ease and sweetness void of pride might hide her faults, if bells had faults to hide. If to her share some female errors fall, look on her face, and you'll forget 'em all. Now, a couple of things in there. The bit about Jews is significant there, perhaps more to modern ears than at the time. But that little moment just reminds you that Pope, the Catholic outcast from polite, Church of England society, is very aware of that identity and that value in there, and he probably identifies a little bit more with the Jews and infidels than he might let on in polite company. But there, he's just using it as a kind of marker for what he can't say. He doesn't want to bring up Catholicism itself, although the stately grandeur of the ceremony of getting dressed, I think, is his way of hinting at that and getting it in there. And also, aside from the silliness and the picture of this graceful, lovely young lady drifting into a room and being just so perfect and never making a false move in public, there is that sort of wistful, dreamy quality as she comes in. It's like a slow motion entrance in a rom-com. But you look at the flowing, lilting language that is used in there, and it just sweeps you along and is so light and airy. And then you hit that final line of this little section. If to her share some female errors fall, look on her face and you'll forget 'em all. So after this light and lively and so flowing and mellifluous lead up. That last line, forget 'em all, just sounds so coarse, which again is the two-handed bit where he is playing on that very flowing lyrical tradition that sounds so elevated and lovely, and then gets really right down to it at the very end and hits him with something just a little edgy and coarse. And you can hear him sort of like leaning in and saying, you'll forget them all. It's funny. It also pumps up the rhythm a little bit, where he is always within that very regular heroic couplet, closed couplet format that he writes. He does alternate the rhythm an awful lot, and you hear a lot of that throughout, where he's not afraid to shift around the meter a little bit, where the rhyme is always there, but the rhythm does sort of alternate, because he recognizes that, especially in a poem this long, the rhythm gets a little stale after a little while. It becomes just sort of dog trot and regular and predictable, and you end up forcing lots of stuff into this rhythm that might not naturally flow, and he has too good of an ear for that. So he will shift that up from time to time to create some variety. Now, the confused priorities of high society also make for a very sharp critique within the mock heroic mode. The sylph Ariel charges the divine world with serving the petty concerns of society, as if this were a dignified and fully meritorious duty for the divine realm. This day black omens threat the brightest fair that e'er deserved a watchful spirit's care. Some dire disaster, or by force or sleight, but what or where the fates have wrapped in night. Whether the nymph shall break Diana's law, or some frail china jar receive a flaw, or stain her honor, or her new brocade forget her prayers, or miss a masquerade, or lose her heart or necklace at a ball, or whether heaven has doomed, that shock must fall. Now, shock, we are told, is a little lapdog. So, it's the death of a little puppy, or maybe not so young, but the death of a pet, perhaps elevated to the level of the death of a great hero of warfare, and all the little quirks in there I think are funny, and whether nymph shall break Diana's law, chastity, or some frail china jar receive a flaw. Oh my God, heavens to Murgatroyd, you chipped a teacup. Or stain her honor, or her new brocade, or forget her prayers, or miss a masquerade, or lose her heart or necklace at a ball. Her heart or a necklace. Think about that, put in such close proximity to one another. Her heart. All right, sure. I will say that any character, male or female, losing their heart, falling, having their heart broken or so, is tragic in a tragic mode. Not necessarily a heroic mode, not an epic mode, but in a tragic mode, sure. But a necklace? So now suddenly the heart, the symbol of the human soul, if you will, is being equated to a piece of jewelry. Ooh, a little sharp. Pope is not afraid to throw some elbows. But that's the sylph. The narrator himself even gets in on all these wry observations to scorn more explicitly the royal court of the, at that time, sitting Queen Anne. Hither the heroes and the nymphs resort to taste awhile the pleasures of a court. In various talk the instructive hours they passed. Who gave the ball or paid the visit last? One speaks the glory of the British Queen, and one describes a charming India screen. A third interprets motions, looks, and eyes. At every word a reputation dies. Snuff or the fan supply each pause of chat with singing, laughing, ogling, and all that. You hear the somewhat blood-dripping savagery of an observer of idle aristocratic life, specifically around the court of Anne here. The idea that they're all off at their at a country estate and just lounging around and concerned with the minorest of details, you know, but of course these are major details to them. Who gave the ball or paid the visit last? Who paid for this or what? Who went there? Or, okay, I visited her. She has not visited me. Oh my God, this is a great affront. These are great concerns that are being raised to an absurd level in this little patch. At every word, a reputation dies. You know, again, think of think of all the bloody battles of the Iliad. Is the fall of all of those men, all of those heroes, equivalent to a reputation dying? Little arch. And I love the end. Again, he builds up to so much with singing, laughing, ogling, and all that. And all that is just another coarse term saying, you know, and all that, whatever. Now, at one point, a vast battle. It's an epic. You have to have a battle. A vast battle is waged in card playing, followed by the archly ceremonial coffee service, and that is a long stretch where it can be difficult to follow if you are unfamiliar with the card game. And I would imagine even if you are familiar with the card game, it can be difficult to follow as well. And it is all a psychological game of dominance and strategy and deception and ploys and all of this warfare over a game of cards. Again, the idle occupations of the aristocracy. In this scene, we also find Clarissa, a friend of Belinda's, another noble lady at the court, perhaps less celebrated for her beauty than the perfect Belinda. She slips the Baron a pair of scissors from her shining case. The ladies always have a little accoutrement of beauty tools and accessories that they can deploy, weapons that they can deploy throughout the day. And so she is instigating this. She is enabling this. She hands him the weapon. Now, there is some culpability there, obviously. The Baron then, the man in question, the bad guy, is frustrated by the sylph's defenses. They keep, screwing up his effort, let's say. But then he finally goes in for the steal. The pier now spreads the glittering forefects wide to enclose the lock, now joins it to divide. Even then, before the fatal engine closed, a wretched sylph too fondly interposed. Fate urged the shears and cut the sylph in twain, but airy substance soon unites again. The meeting points the sacred hair to sever from the fair head forever and forever. This is the extreme close-up in this moment. This is the crisis brought to a head. And I love the focus on the scissors itself. And still, even that action has its frame of opposites in there. Now joins it to divide. He joins the scissors, the blades of the scissors, to divide the hair. So always that matching of it's one thing and it's the other. And I love that they divide. In this, there is this heroic last attempt after they have been sort of swatting away and defending her. These divine beings have been defending Belinda's hair. Finally, when he goes in and he actually gets the hair, one of them dives in to try and save it, sacrificing him or herself, however you want to gender these things, and he or she is cut in two along with the hair. But of course, since this is a silly little salon of among aristocrats, nothing matters. So this elf is fixed again. And he's like, well, you can't really cut me in half. Yeah, sure, you slice me in half and I come right back together. It's simple. The rules are absurd. Uh, Now, this affront to the divine realm sparks a whole outrage among the fellow divinities, the other sylphs, and there's this huge scene that is way over the top in Canto 4 as an affront to ideal beauty. And okay, sure, now we're starting to really get into that contrast with the ideal beauty, the notion of a human assault on the ideal. And you see again that contrast between the ideal and the real. And we're not always sure where we should fall on this. But Canto 5, probably the best part of this poem, quite frankly, begins with Clarissa making a very sensible plea for perspective and good humor. Remember, she's the one who kind of started it. But her plea denigrates the destructive worship of beauty and the superficiality it promotes, which you can see as condescending to her compatriots around there, and maybe even a little misogynist. She is poo-pooing all of the attitudes and the focus on beauty, female beauty especially, which is the female realm. And this becomes even more complicated when you remember that writing this behind the character of Clarissa is Alexander Pope, who, as a deformed human being, a person with some physical irregularities, let's say, that basically condemned him to being single for his entire life. He was very ill. He had a hunchback. He was very short. You can see where he might have an axe to grind about conventional notions of beauty and the centrality that physical attractiveness plays in society. You can see him having a bit of an edge on that question. And so here he is giving vent to it. And it does come off as a little judgmental, certainly, but also a little misogynist. You can't help but interpret it as that. He positions that perspective within a pose of reasonableness that is so endemic to the Enlightenment as a whole, and objective moderation between all these extremes. But there's always that undercurrent that keeps us saying, all right, yeah, you've got an agenda, pal. And that, I think, undercuts the effectiveness, or maybe is the larger point. I'm not sure. Then grave Clarissa graceful waved her fan, silence ensued, and thus the nymph began. Say, why are beauties praised and honored most, the wise man's passion, the vain man's toast? Why decked with all that land and sea afford? Why angels called and angel-like adored? Why round our coaches crowd the white-gloved beaux? Why bows the side-box from its inmost rows? How vain are all these glories, all our pains, unless good sense preserve what beauty gains? That men may say when we the front box grace, behold the first in virtue, as in face. Oh, if to dance all night and dress all day charmed the smallpox or chased old age away, who would not scorn what housewife's cares produce, or who would learn one earthly thing of use? To patch, nay, ogle might become a saint, nor could it sure be such a sin to paint. But since, alas, frail beauty must decay, curled or uncurled, since locks will turn to gray, since painted or not painted, all shall fade, and she who scorns a man must die a maid. What then remains but well our power to use, and keep good humor still whatever we lose? And trust me, dear, good humor can prevail when airs and flights and screams and scalding fail. Beauties in vain their pretty lies may roll, charms strike the sight, but merit wins the soul. Now, charms strike this again. The final lines of these often put a little bit of a twist on it. And charms strike the sight, but merit wins the soul. That is something that you might find framed and embroidered somewhere. Pope is great for quotations, quite frankly, but especially for embroidered things. But it is obviously also a little banal. It is a little cliche. Charms strike the sight, but merit wins the soul. Yes, it's a truism, but it just seems a little tut-tutty, you know? He's just a little censorious here. It's just a little trite, quite frankly. The ridiculousness of this poem is a frothy balloon that bops along for quite some time. Sorry to mix a couple of metaphors there, but but when he centers it on this one speech at the end, I'm not sure if this is meant to be taken at all ironically. Certainly there is a lot of good common sense in this, and it's very English middle class way, but there is also it's hard to read this as not a little misogynist, like I said, and B, just a little bit condescending. And the natural reaction to condescension is to pull back a little. And certainly, as such an outsider in this milieu, Pope would have been used to a fair amount of condescension. So when he is elevating this voice and making it just so not snarky, but just so honestly sincere, but a little just barely over the top in its primness, there is a reaction to that. And having been trained throughout this poem to never take anything particularly literally, to always judge and position yourself independent of the many perspectives, we have to deal with the fact that this is also just another perspective. And that is, I think, as valid a point of the speech as the one it seems to be making. You need to read it first for what it says, and then then a second time for what it could mean. You read it sincerely and ironically simultaneously. Only through this can we really get an objective idea of what anything means, by alternating our perspective. That is the larger point of this poem. And by keeping things in perspective, we are not so upset by them. We don't get over dramatic about everything, and we can maintain a certain calm, cool, and collected nature, again, very English, that inures us to the disturbances of violent outbreaks, which, again, is the Enlightenment. So following this, an epic brawl breaks out. Despite Clarissa's plea, she is basically ignored. But it is mostly noise and sharp looks, the kind of battle you would find in a cocktail party where everyone's talking about one another and everybody is like, come on. Belinda assaults the Baron with snuff. And demands her hair back, but it's already been raised to heaven, ennobling the immaterial divinity beyond the petty context of the superficial, obsessed royal court. It's gone. It's up there. It's silly, like the story itself, almost like the poem itself, where it has been lifted to a realm that is outside the grasp of common hands. And it is hysterical in its way. The poem as a whole can be a little bit long to get through. It is a single sitting poem, but it takes a little while to plow through. So you got to have a comfortable chair. But it rewards it because you can just sit back and enjoy it. And there are a number of little lines in there that have packs and packs of meaning crammed into them. And they are fun to untie and unpuzzle, but you don't have to. You can just go along for the ride. It is a very silly ride, and like all good comedy, you can just sit there and go along for the laughs, and that is more than enough. But if you want to stick around for a little bit more, if you want to dig into it and see, well, what exactly is the joke here? I get that it's just sort of silly on the surface, but what's really prompting that laughter? Then there is stuff there. Then you can dig in. Then you can find something underneath there. And that's where the real fun begins, quite frankly, when you can start to get inside the joke. And like all good inside jokes, feel a part of the consciousness and the community that crafts it.